NSA was essentially scooping up all the talented cryptographers in the country in the United States. So all of the talent was there, and they were developing tools. This is a government-funded institution. The taxpayers funding this.
Just footing the bill, yeah.
Yeah, and they have developed something that's crucial for the future of humanity, basically, and they shouldn't keep it to themselves. The NSA at this time was actually a secret government agency.
Nobody knew it existed at all.
No, exactly. Like nowadays, people know that it exists. We might not know exactly what they're doing, but we at least know it exists.
Well, thanks to Edward Snowden, we have a large idea of what they're doing, and it's largely unconstitutional.
For most of human history, if you wanted to encrypt messages, so if you wanted to communicate in a way that was private, you needed symmetric encryption.
Welcome to the next episode of our podcast series with Aaron Van Weerdum, the author of the Genesis book. Today we're going to talk about cryptography and many of the early cryptographers that made Bitcoin possible. Welcome, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks.
So let's start with Whitfield Diffie.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain the basic concept behind the substitution cipher, just a very basic form of cryptography? What is cryptography and why is it important?
So for most of human history, if you wanted to encrypt messages, so if you wanted to communicate in a way that was private, you needed symmetric encryption. So the military, for example, if they wanted to communicate, without the enemy being able to listen in, they would use symmetric encryption. Now, what that means is you have an encryption key. So you have a key and you use a mathematical formula to encrypt the information. And then you would use the same key in reverse to decrypt the information. So a very, the most basic example you can think of is probably, it's called the Caesar cipher. And let's say that you use the encryption key +1, which is obviously not secure, but just to give an example. What that would mean is that every letter in the alphabet would be replaced by the next letter in the alphabet. So if you send Apple, then the A would be replaced by a B, and the P would be replaced by a Q, I believe, right? No, P. Yeah. And so the L would be replaced with an M, and the E would be replaced by an F. And then you send whatever I just spelled out. You send that. I send that to you with the encryption key. So I encrypted it +1, and then you decrypt it with +1 in reverse. You just subtract every letter by 1. Now that's a very basic example, but you can make that pretty complex. And at some point in the 20th century, that was so complex that you could communicate quite securely. You would use parts of a text to decrypt, to encrypt other parts of the text, and it got complex and it got pretty secure. But you would still need to exchange this key. So the only way to do that really securely is to exchange it in person. Like if I send you the encryption key over radio or over telephone or whatever we're using, then if that message is intercepted by the enemy, then they can, after that, just decrypt all our communication as well.
It's like a man-in-the-middle attack, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. So it worked, but you would need to meet in person. So for the internet, that's obviously not ideal.
Yeah.
On the internet, you want to be able to communicate with anyone, anywhere, anytime, and you can't meet everyone first. So another solution was needed. And Whitfield Diffie, he was a mathematician. He worked at the MIT AI lab for a while. And he, even at a young age, he was very interested in cryptography, ciphers. Like he thought this was all very interesting. But he was working at AI lab, and keep in mind, we discussed this in a previous episode, that at the AI lab at MIT, the hacker culture was very popular. And that was all about freeing information in a way, right? Like it was about collaborative working on projects, and information should be free. Now Whitfield Diffie worked there as well, so he was one of the hackers essentially. But he had a different
ethos, essentially.
Well, I don't know if he had a different ethos completely, but he had at least set out to accomplish a different goal. Or kind of two goals. So what he saw two problems that he wanted to solve. One of them was authentication. So if I send you a message, how do you know for sure that was me that sent it to you? How do you know if a digital message is really coming from me and not from someone else pretending to be me? So in the analog world, with paper, we use signatures for that. So you sign off on a contract, you sign off on a letter, and that's how you would know that it's really me. It's kind of an imperfect solution, but
Definitely.
yeah, but at least that it's a solution. Now he wanted to create something like that was digital, and then the other thing, as I mentioned, is he wants to create something that would lock up information, really, would sort of hide information, would create sort of like a vault for information. And he thought cryptography could be a good use of that. But he didn't know how to do it. Now, he did hear rumors, so to say, that the NSA had this technology, specifically the encryption technology. So that the NSA had some solution to accomplish this, but they weren't sharing it with the public.
He didn't like that.
Yeah, so keep in mind that at this time, and we're talking about like 60s, 70s, the NSA was essentially scooping up all the talented cryptographers in the country, in the United States. So all of the talent was there, and they were developing tools. And so Whitfield Diffie had heard that they were working on some encryption tool. And he didn't like that it was not available to the public. He thought this is a government-funded institution. The taxpayers funding this.
It's footing the bill, yeah.
Yeah, and they have developed something that's crucial for the future of humanity, basically, and they shouldn't keep it to themselves. So he set out to... one thing that's maybe interesting to mention is that the NSA at this time was actually a secret government agency.
Nobody knew it existed at all.
No, exactly. Like nowadays, people know that it exists. We might not know exactly what they're doing, but we at least know it exists.
Well, thanks to Edward Snowden, we have a large idea of what they're doing, and it's largely unconstitutional and goes against the ethos of the American Constitution and experiment, right? So
yeah, I mean, you can make a very good case that it goes against the Fourth Amendment.
Absolutely,
a lot of their activity. But in any case, at this time, it wasn't even known that they existed at all, which is an interesting tidbit. But so, although it was sort of a public secret, right? They jokingly said that NSA stood for no such agency.
Yeah, that's funny.
But Whitfield Diffie, he set out to basically reinvent or rediscover whatever technologies NSA had. So at some point, he got a girlfriend, and he started traveling the United States. So
she was a scientist, right?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what her job or occupation was, actually.
I think you mentioned here.
Oh, did I?
Brooklyn-based animal trainer. So I guess she was in.
Yeah, that I remember. Yeah. So that's not very scientific.
I wasn't sure if she worked in like a zoo or something. She was a zoologist or.
I don't know either, to be honest. Animal trainer is all I know. So he and her, they got a car and they started traveling the United States, and he would go and visit cryptographers, also the author of a book on cryptography that in turn had interviewed defectors from the NSA that fled to the Soviet Union at that time. And he just started reading books, exploring, this whole field essentially from bottom to top. And he
was this Code Breakers?
Yeah, that's the book. That's correct. That's the name of the book. So he wanted to create, both digital authentication and encryption tools. That's what he set out to do. He didn't really know how, but he did intuitively figure out or thought that a one-way function could be a big part of it. So a one-way function in math is it's like a formula that's easy to calculate in one direction, but impossible to calculate in the other direction. So if you put an input in that formula, then you get the output easily. But if you have only the output, then it's basically impossible to get the input. So let's say you put in 16 and the output is 184, goes through some formula, the output is 184. That's very easy. If you put in 16 the next time, 184 will come out every time. Obviously, math, the formula.
This is a big part of how Bitcoin works when where everyone can verify that the work was done essentially from block to block.
Yeah,
to move on to the next block.
Yeah. Hashing is a one-way function.
Okay.
And hashing is a big part of Bitcoin, obviously.
Yeah.
So you put in 16, you get 184. But what if you put in 184? Well, you don't get 16. So it's like this one-way function. He thought that was going to be a big part of the solution, maybe. Maybe also worth mentioning, there was also this concept of a trapdoor. So a trapdoor would then mean, so the input is 16, the output is 184. Now the trapdoor is like a secret key that would actually get you back to 16. Or did I say 18? 16, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so now you have 184 is the output, and there's a secret key. What did I just say? Oh, you got a secret key, and that brings you back to 16. So these were sort of very basic concepts that he knew existed, or at least that he knew mathematicians were playing around with, or thought could exist in different forms. And he thought that would be a very basic component of a solution like this.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't actually figure it out. Now, at some point during his travels, he met with Martin Hellman. So Martin Hellman was a university professor at Stanford, I want to say. Is it Stanford? Do you have
Let me check on that. But real quick before we move on, Aaron, I think you do a really good job of illustrating this concept of a one-way function with the use of a polynomial.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to use that example here to explain it for our listeners here, because I think it makes a lot of sense. So here you say, to understand this concept, right, in like basic algebra, you'd say like x to the second power minus 5x plus 8. And if the input x in this example is 16, it's relatively easy to calculate that the equation would produce the output 184.
Wait, is that the actual example I used in the book?
You used in the book.
Oh,
yeah.
That. I don't know if that's a coincidence or something in my brain. Definitely
something in your brain for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
I apparently have these numbers in my brain.
You do. 16, 184. You hit it nail on the head, right? So that's awesome.
Interesting.
So it would produce the output 184. However, when you're given only the output of 184, the equation can't be used in reverse to easily calculate that the original input x was 16. So that's a great way to illustrate that. Like if you just give somebody 184, there's no way they could get back to 16.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. or it would take them massive amounts of time anyways.
Absolutely.
So he met with Martin Hellman during his travels. That was one of the people he met with. And when he met Martin Hellman, for the first time, really, he found someone that was trying to solve the same problem.
Similar problem, yeah.
And in somewhat the same way as well. Like Martin Hellman had also been thinking about this. He'd, by the way, rejected a job offer from NSA for the same ideological reason.
Oh, nice.
Like he also thought that his work should benefit the public, not just the NSA. So he rejected that offer, and he would go to work as a university professor. And they met, and it was like they finally met someone else who was thinking about the same problem, and they discussed it, passionately for hours. Like it was supposed to be like a 30-minute meeting in Hellman's office, and then they ended up discussing it basically the whole day. And then even after the end of the day, they would go to Martin Hellman's home, and they would sort of keep discussing it. And it was sort of the beginning of a friendship. Plus, Martin Hellman would soon hire Whitfield Diffie at the university to, become a colleague with him. And they start to try to solve this challenge together. You want to jump in there, or should I just keep riffing?
No. I think you leading us up to the next idea and concept that they developed together, which is this idea of key pairs, public key and a private key.
Yeah.
So maybe we can just go right into that, because that's very important to Bitcoin, especially, but as a cryptographical breakthrough to achieve these types of systems, right?
Yeah.
To solve some of these problems that you described earlier.
So the solution they eventually came up with was public key cryptography. This was also partly based on a idea or scheme by Ralph Merkle, who was a third cryptographer. He was a bit younger. He was still a student. He designed his own sort of cryptography tool. He was also trying to solve a similar problem, and he used a scheme that required sort of sending puzzles back and forth. I could get into that if you want. Should we skip that?
I mean, you can give a little brief overview of Ralph Merkle, because Merkle trees are a very important concept. So definitely something to briefly talk about.
Yeah, so his idea was if Alice and Bob want to communicate privately, Alice and Bob are, the two classic names that are used when
So
describing
I was going to
schemes like
ask you
this.
that because that's like everywhere you read. I think even Satoshi uses, Alice and Bob when he's describing something online. If I remember correctly, I could be wrong on that, but I think that did pique my interest, right? So he definitely had a background in cryptography, obviously with what he developed. But
I think the names Alice and Bob may have been first used by Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman. I'm not completely sure about that, but I think it's possible that they were. And then since then, every other cryptographer basically uses Alice and Bob. And
I've always been interested in that.
There's a bunch more characters to that story. There's also like a Carol. And,
yep. A, B, C.
Eve the eavesdropper. And I don't know. There's like a whole family now. But anyways, Merkel's proposal was like a puzzle scheme. So what would happen is Alice would create a bunch of puzzles, say thousands, 10,000s, maybe even a million, a lot of puzzles. And these puzzles could be solved with a bit of computing power. So you get a puzzle, you make some computations on it, and then the answer of the puzzle pops up. Now, the answer of each puzzle would be a secret key, essentially. So let's say you have 1,000 puzzles. Therefore, 1,000 secret keys are all hidden in these puzzles. Now, what would happen is Alice would send all 1,000 puzzles to Bob, and then Bob would randomly pick one puzzle to solve. So he would pick puzzle 112. He solves that puzzle with a little bit of computing power, and then sends the number of the puzzle back to Alice. So he says, I solved puzzle 112. Now, Alice immediately knows what secret key Bob found because she knows he solved puzzle 112. Well, no, I'm saying it wrong. Oh, yeah. Okay, no. The 112 is also hidden in the puzzle. So it's not like they have a public number. Like every puzzle has a secret key and a number hidden in the puzzle. Mm-hmm. Okay. So Bob sends the number 112 back to Alice. So now Alice immediately knows which puzzle Bob solved, and therefore also what secret key he found. Now, if someone's listening into the conversation, they don't know which puzzle Bob solved because they don't know which number matches which secret key, right?
They would have to solve all the puzzles with a massive amount of...
Exactly. So they would now have to randomly start solving all the puzzles until they also find 112, and only then will they have the secret key. Before that, unless and until this eavesdropper has actually solved all these puzzles, or at least enough to find the 112 secret number, until then, Alice and Bob can communicate secretly using the secret key. So this allowed Alice and Bob to communicate relatively privately. It's not perfect because an eavesdropper could invest all this computing power in trying to solve all these puzzles and finding the answer. But it's pretty good. It's better than having to exchange a key in person, or at least Merkel thought so. I mean, Merkel thought this is a breakthrough.
So it's definitely a breakthrough. I mean, it's definitely a step in the right direction, right? This idea of brute force, right? So that's the attack vector, right? Mm-hmm. Brute force just means you have to solve every single one of those puzzles. It's going to take you a long time, and it's just a lot of extra work for the man in the middle or the attacker, potential eavesdropper.
Yeah, so there's this asymmetric benefits for Alice and Bob. Like they don't have to make all these computations to communicate privately, but an attacker, an eavesdropper, would have to make all these computations.
Absolutely.
So it would at least make spying expensive. Mm-hmm. So that's a big step forward. So Whitfield Diffie, it's worth mentioning Merkel, he proposed that at his university, which was keeping track of every university where all these people worked.
I want to say it was Berkeley, but I'm not positive.
It was definitely the University of California. I don't know, probably Berkeley.
Let me see here.
Anyways,
so here you wrote, but Merkel hadn't been able to convince anyone else. His idea received little praise at Berkeley, while his paper was rejected by the Communications of the ACM, the prestigious journal of the Association for Computing Machinery.
Right. Yeah. So he thought he had a good idea, but it was basically rejected by everyone at his university.
And the world just wasn't ready to understand, basically. We see this.
You see it that way, for sure. But then he found the first proposal by Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman, which we'll get to in a minute. And then he thought, hey, I'm not the only one trying to solve this problem. So he contacted Martin Hellman, and at that point, Martin Hellman took Ralph Merkle on as an intern at his university, which I still think was probably Stanford. And now 3 people were sort of trying to solve the same problem. Mm-hmm. So the solution that Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman came up with was public key cryptography. So what public key cryptography is it's a way, so now you could share your public key publicly. Mm-hmm. So everyone has 2 keys rather than 1. So instead of this symmetric encryption key, which is 1 key that you share, everyone has 2 keys. You have a private key that you keep private, that's your own secret. And then from that private key, you can actually derive a public key through a one-way function. And this public key you share publicly. Anyone can see this public key. What that allows people to do is they can take your public key, encrypt information with this public key, and then decrypt it with the private key. That was the proposal. That was the first proposal. Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman did not immediately know how to do it, but they liked the idea and they published a paper on this. This is the paper that Ralph Merkle then read, and the reason why he got in contact with Martin Hellman, and the reason they started to think about the problem with the 3 of them. Oh, one thing that I should mention real quick is the problem with Merkle's solution is that it scales linearly. So if you want to make it harder to crack, you just need to send more puzzles. Like if you want to make your scheme 10 times harder to crack, you need to send 10 times as many puzzles. If you want to make it 100 times harder to crack, you need to send 100 times as many puzzles. So this would mean that if you want to secure privately, you need to actually send a lot of data. It was a very data-heavy solution, and it didn't scale very well in that sense. So that's why Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman, although they were intrigued by the idea and they were kind of inspired by it, I would say, they didn't actually adopt it because they didn't like that it didn't scale very well.
It was a step in the right direction, right?
Yeah,
but it
exactly.
wasn't, if it couldn't scale exponentially, essentially, it's, it's not going to stop a sophisticated attacker, government, listener, et cetera, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they wanted to come up with something that actually scales exponentially. Mm-hmm. So even if you send a little bit more data, that makes it 10 times as hard to crack.
Exactly.
Crack. And then a little bit more data, and then 10 times harder to crack again. So not necessarily 10 times as many data, but maybe twice as many data, 10 times harder to crack, for an example. So that makes it exponential instead of linear. Mm-hmm. At some point, Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman did crack the at least the first version of their idea. This is called the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Do you want to get into how that works, like mathematically, technically?
Talking about the concept of a shared secret, and I would say let's try to communicate it in layman's terms as best as possible.
I think the short version of the story, is the way you would do it is you would combine. So I want to send data to you and I want to encrypt it. Mm-hmm. What do? I take your public key, which is available to everyone, and my private key, which is only available to me, and I put this data that I want to encrypt through both keys. So I calculate it, I multiply it through both of our keys. Then you get the encrypted result of that. You can decrypt it by doing the opposite. So you take my public key and your private key. What you technically do is you combine these, you multiply these, and then you use that basically as a symmetric key to decrypt it. So we can both create the same secret key. You can create it by taking my public key and your private key and multiplying these, mm-hmm. and I can do it by taking my private key and your public key and multiplying these. No one else can do it because
they don't have
to do this, you need at least one of our private keys.
Absolutely.
So no one else in the world other than us has one of our private keys. So that's why we can create a secret key that no one else can figure out. And then when you have this secret key, you use this to encrypt data. Now the opposite is also possible. Mm-hmm. I can. I'm skipping ahead now, but we can skip ahead. So the next step in the evolution here was RSA. This stands for Rivest, Edelman, and Shamir. Rivest, Shamir, Edelman,
I think it was those
RSA.
3 other mathematicians from MIT.
Yeah, the 3 cryptographers. Were they at MIT?
I believe so.
Again, I'm fuzzy on which
Addy,
university was which
Shamir,
exactly.
Leonard Adelman.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they came up with an even better scheme. They kind of so this the idea the Diffie-Hellman key exchange was published in a paper, and it really set off a revolution in cryptography. It inspired other cryptographers around the world, and then 3 of the cryptographers it inspired were Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman. And then they kind of perfected the scheme. So they figured out this public key cryptography system idea is super interesting. And then they used another way of doing it using prime factorization. Now that gets a little bit complicated to maybe explain on this podcast. Mm-hmm. But the short version of it is that it works as the original vision of Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman proposed it should. So now it was really the case that you could use my public key to encrypt information, and then I could use my private key to decrypt it. Now there's an interesting additional feature here. What I can also do is I can encrypt the information with my private key and then send the message and the encrypted version of it to you, or even just only the encrypted version actually. And then you can decrypt it with my public key. So I'm encrypting it with my private key, and then you can decrypt it with my public key. So what this does is it shows that I really encrypted it with my private key. No one else could have done that. Mm-hmm. Since you are able to decrypt it with my public key, it shows that I did it and no one else, which therefore proves that I signed the message. So it provided a form of digital authentication. Like it must have been me that encrypted this message because you can decrypt it with my public key. So with RSA, 2 problems were solved at once. 1, you can encrypt data with someone's public key and then that person can decrypt it. 2, you can sign messages by encrypting it yourself and letting other people decrypt it.
I know in your book we talk so much about how all of these technologies led up to Bitcoin, but this is also super important for the next era that we're entering of humanity with AI and all these where people can just essentially render and generate fake things, right? So these concepts are not only relevant just to Bitcoin, but also to so much of the things that's going to happen in the future, whether it be news agencies releasing news reports, right? We want to have that verifiable proof that it was actually them who did that, right? Yeah. Or if this news video is real, we want to have it signed off by the author that they are the ones who actually made that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's already a big part of the internet.
Yeah.
If you visit website and it's HTTPS, then you know for sure that you're actually connected to the right website. You got this lock in your screen, right?
Absolutely.
And as you mentioned, like going forward into the future, I think authentication is going to be an absolutely massive part of any media we consume, basically. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, to point out why it's relevant to Bitcoin, in Bitcoin, if you want to send a message, if you want to send a transaction, I should really say, then you use your private key to sign off on that transaction.
Yes.
So you sign the transaction showing that the owner of the coins really signs off to it, that no one else can do that. No one else can steal your coins or forge a signature. It has to be the person that actually owns the coins, that has the coins attributed to that public key.
That private key really is the proof of ownership.
Yeah.
Right? It really is what allows Bitcoin and electronic digital cash that's decentralized to be possible, right? Or to be private as well, right? To have that security. It's like the blockchain. The way I always visualize it is like the blockchain is this giant safety deposit box that is on the internet, and only you with a private key that you have can look at these different safety deposit boxes, but only you can open up that box and send those funds, right? That private key. If anybody else has it, they can then send all of those funds, but that key gives you access to open your box and send those funds.
Yes, exactly.
Which is very powerful, right? Because just having that private key is just, it's simply information, right? And people, as we know, information can be taken anywhere in your brain. It can be stored on a piece of paper. It really is global. It can be taken anywhere. It can be taken with you if you're fleeing oppressive government, or if you're leaving or going somewhere, right? Or just for all intents and purposes, nobody could even know that you have that private key, right? It really gives you a level of freedom that has not existed previously until the invention of Bitcoin.
Yeah, ownership really consists of information. It's really a piece of data, a private key, or which you can translate into a seed phrase, so 12 or 24 words, and that really represents your ownership. It's purely digital information.
Let's talk about David Chaum, because he's a very important character in all of this.
Yeah, so this invention, public key cryptography by Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman, really set off a revolution in the field. It showed what was possible, and from there a number of other innovations emerged, and other cryptographers got inspired by that. So one of them is David Chaum, indeed. David Chaum was a cryptographer, also at Berkeley. I'm pretty sure. You want to look that up? I'm pretty sure.
I know he grew up in L.A., University of Cal. He attended the University of California, Los Angeles. He switched to the University of Sonora in Mexico to be close to his girlfriend.
Yeah, that's right.
He finally graduated from the University of California, San Diego.
Anyways, it's not the most important thing. There are details that indeed will sort of slip my mind. Which
we got to give the listeners a reason to read your book, right? Because we're not going to cover all of the interesting, cool stories that are in there, right? I mean, we're going to talk about a lot of the underlying, topics, but there's still a lot of, and that's what I really love about your book is that you really added personal stories about their lives and details like that, which kind of add to all of these characters that are part of this giant play.
Right.
That eventually turns into Bitcoin, right? So
right.
Definitely there's a lot of cool little tidbits and fun stories and things in there as well, which we won't go too much into detail about. But
so anyways, one of the things that started happening was crypto conferences started to be organized. So this revolution in cryptography found a home in the crypto conference. And but worth mentioning, the NSA wasn't very happy with this. After the first one happened, they didn't want this strong cryptography to spread because it would, make their lives more difficult. And then David Chaum, a young cryptographer at the time, he took it upon himself to organize the second one. So the way he did that was he would actually meet with people in person, to stop the NSA from, spying on him, and maybe paper letters and that kind of stuff, but at least no phone calls.
So let me ask you about this. This is my favorite version of David Chaum, the young, the idealist. He has this cypherpunk ethos, right? But later on, it's like he rejects the cypherpunks. It's almost like Star Wars, right? Where Anakin Skywalker, turns into Darth Vader. I mean, I don't want to go that far.
I wouldn't go that far.
I wouldn't go that far, but I'm just saying it seems like the young version of David Chaum was much more idealist, and even reading some of the things he wrote here. So I'll read what he wrote. But like Diffie before him, Chaum also recognized that this transformation could lead to a rather dystopian future. He understood that if messages, documents, or files are sent over the internet, all this data would be at risk of being monitored, intercepted, and exploited by tyrants on a scale never seen before. Because people's behavior changes when they think that they might be watched, mass surveillance would create a prison of the mind, breed conformity, and ultimately destroy basic liberties, Chaum worried. Cyberspace doesn't have all the physical constraints, Chaum later explained to a reporter from a technology magazine, Wired. There are no walls. It's a different, scary, weird place. And with identification, it's a panopticon nightmare, right? Everything you do could be known to anyone else, could be recorded forever. It's antithetical to the basic principles underlying the mechanisms of democracy. This is some fascinating stuff, right? So even the concept, this idea of people's behavior changing when they know they're being watched, right?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, to your point about the cypherpunk, so we'll get to that more later. But David Chaum was a huge inspiration for the cypherpunks.
Absolutely.
But he was never a cypherpunk himself. He thought the cypherpunks were too radical because Chaum wasn't very libertarian. He was not a libertarian. He did believe in privacy very strongly, obviously, but not in the same way that Tim May believed in privacy or for the same reason. But in any case, he organized the second crypto conference and then also one in Europe. But he was also himself a brilliant cryptographer. And one of the first proposals he made were remailers. And this is the precursor to Tor. So you could encrypt data, you could encrypt messages, but over email, you could still monitor who's communicating with who, right? You can still see Alice is emailing Bob, for example. So he came up with a way to hide that as well. And these are called remailers. So how that would work is there is a remailer, a server. Someone is, operating on their computer a remailer. And then what Alice would do is encrypt the message to Bob, but then also encrypt Bob's email address itself and encrypt, am I saying that? Yeah, so encrypt the message to Bob and then wrap this into a new layer of encryption, which also encrypts Bob's email address. But this new layer of encryption is actually encrypted with the public key of the remailer. So then you send it to the remailer, then the remailer takes one layer of encryption off, finds another encrypted message plus Bob's email address, and now sends it to Bob. So now Alice isn't emailing Bob, but the remailer is emailing Bob. Alice is emailing the remailer is emailing Bob. Now you can add in more remailers. So I just gave an example with one remailer, but you can have 5 or 6 or however many you want. And then every remailer has one layer of encryption that they can peel off. So Alice sends it to remailer 1, then remailer 1 sends it to remailer 2, remailer 2 sends it to remailer 3, etc. until the last remailer sends it to Bob. And then Bob can finally decrypt the message itself. So for every remailer, every hop, there's a layer of encryption. They can all peel one off. Again, this predates Tor. This is sort of what inspires how Tor works today.
Yeah.
So he came up with that, and that turned out to be one of the big cypherpunk projects as well.
Here it says 1981, untraceable electronic mail, return addresses, digital pseudonyms. So that was his paper that he proposed there. He was very, very active. He provided a lot of groundwork for the cypherpunks and many of the communities that many of the even the cryptography mailing list, all of these different things that came after him. So he contributed a lot to the field.
Yeah, maybe another or the relevant topic. While we're on the topic of cryptography, I take a different order in the Genesis book. But Merkle trees, should we get into that?
Yeah, we definitely can talk about Merkle trees, which were related to Ralph Merkle.
Yeah, so that's another innovation by Ralph Merkle. I'll keep this one short. But he came up with a way to sort of store data in a compact way. Or it's not really storing the data; it's more storing
proof of the data proof that the data happened. Right?
Yes, that's it. That's a good way to put it. So basically, he would use hashes. So as mentioned, a hash is a one-way function. And what a hash does is it produces an output that is of a fixed length. So it doesn't matter what you're hashing. If you're hashing just one letter or an entire book or an entire library, it all results in a hash of the same length. So it looks very random. It looks like you get a scrambled string of numbers, essentially. But it is deterministic. So anytime you put in the same book, you get the same string. Anytime you put in the same letter, you get the same string. And it's all fixed length. So his idea was, if you want to combine a lot of data into little data or into a hash, then you can sort of pair it in pairs. So you take one article and a book, and then another letter and, let's say, another article. You pair them in two. So the first article and the book, you hash both of these, and then the two hashes you hash these together again, and now you have one hash. And then the other letter and the other article, you also hash them, and then you hash these hashes together, and again you get one hash that sort of represents both of these things. Now the two hashes that we ended up with, we can hash these together as well, and now you have one hash. the interesting thing here is that if you want to prove that your article is in this tree, it forms a family tree, right? You only need to provide the article plus sort of the end of each other branch. So you don't need to provide everything that's in the tree. You just give the hash on the right, for example, and then it's hard to explain this in audio. But let's just
I
say
think you're doing a good job. Yeah.
Yeah, you can provide way less data plus the article, and then everyone else can check using the Merkle root, the one hash you ended up with. They can see, yes, this article was originally in this Merkle tree. So indeed, it sort of proves that data existed, for example, at a specific time, without
necessarily having to store all of that data.
Yes, exactly. That's right. So this concept itself was then used for trusted timestamps as well. So this is sort of a subchapter in the Genesis book. You want to get into that?
Is this Stornetta and all of?
Yeah, Stornetta and Haber.
Stornetta and Haber. Let's save that for the next episode.
Sure.
All right, let's wrap here.
Okay.